The creation of citizen search groups to locate Mexico's missing came about as a result of the slow response by the Mexican government to conduct its own investigations into the cases. The search groups receive no government support and they rely on non-governmental organizations for aid and guidance. Joining us now is our political analyst, Laura Carlsen. Laura is part of one of the organizations advising the citizen search groups and the mothers of the missing. Laura, welcome to the show. Lucia Diaz, the leader of these mothers in Veracruz, told our correspondent that there could be between 10,000 and 15,000 bodies buried in graves. How would they know and how can they calculate those numbers?
Elaine, they can't calculate these numbers. This is an estimate, but it's a very possible estimate. They've already found 20,000 fragments, remains in Veracruz alone. We don't know how many bodies they correspond to because those fragments then have to go through a process of DNA testing to figure out the identity of the person and then match those with the DNA samples they have from women. But they found 249 bodies so far, of which only 2 have been identified. And they've only excavated half of the region that they're working on, which doesn't even contemplate the whole of the state of Veracruz. So we're looking at the largest clandestine graveyard in Mexico to date.
Our story also shows Lucia going to Guatemala to learn about forensics since there is no training provided by the government and no forensic labs available to analyze the bodies. How is the government responding to that? And do these women have enough manpower and money to keep going on?
As to the first question, it's pretty much inexplicable why Mexico has not developed a greater forensic capacity after this drug war and this level of violence and the phenomenon of disappearances in the country has been going on for almost 10 years. There's been funding from both the Mexican government and the United States government under the Merida initiative that's been specifically earmarked for forensic analysis. And yet it's not arriving to these groups. It's not in their hands. They're taking years, even with remains that they found, to be identified. And what this means is extending the agony of families who are waiting to find out what happened to their loved ones. So the groups, again, are trying to fill in the gaps that the government has left through being either inept or a lack of political will to really solve the problem. And they're going out to find the advice and the training that they need to try to move this along. The forensic capacity, they've been sending remains to other countries. Mexico should have labs set up by now, but it's a fraction of what's needed.
And once they recover the bodies, it seems there is no formal investigation, legal investigation. So what happens next?
This is another huge problem. I've actually been out on these searches with groups in the state of Veracruz, and it's an utterly contradictory situation because the minute that you find remains, there's a celebration of sorts. Here you are, on the one hand, looking at the proof of another brutal murder that's been buried in the countryside in Veracruz, but at the other hand, you're looking at the possibility that a family could resolve years of waiting and not knowing what happened to their loved one and have a funeral and a type of closure. However, it's only the start of the ordeal because then they do have to rely on the government for the forensic testing to do the identifications and then to deliver the remains to the family. And every step along that way, there are tremendous delays. It's as if the Mexican government didn't want to resolve these cases and put an end to the suffering of the families. There's a high level of frustration at this stage of the search and identity.
So who are the victims? Is there any kind of pattern here?
We don't know because there aren't really investigations. In general, we're in a country that has a 98% impunity rate, and especially with the investigations of the cases of disappeared, it could be even higher. Families will go in and talk to the prosecutors in their states even when they have a great deal of evidence regarding the crime itself. And at times the prosecutors will say to them directly, you know, you should just back off. This is not something you want to get into. In other words, the people who are supposed to be enforcing the law and carrying out justice are telling the victims that they shouldn't even press the case. So they often don't know at all. We have some places in some regions where there seems to be kinds of a pattern. Of course, the biggest one is battles between cartels. The cartels kill individuals that they believe are working with the rival cartel or have some link with the rival cartel, and then eliminate the bodies. And the phenomenon of disappearance occurs because they don't want to have those homicide rates go up. And the government really doesn't want to see the embarrassment of homicide rates go up either. So they began to disappear instead of leaving in public places the bodies of their victims.
And Laura, are these women at risk? A mother was recently killed in Tamaulipas, and her death was linked to being part of one of these search groups.
They're completely at risk. They face great danger to carry out the work that they're doing in these searches for their missing children. Miriam Rodriguez was a spokesperson for the disappeared movement in the state of Tamaulipas, another state that rivals Veracruz in the number of disappeared and the violence that's taking place in that state, as well as the levels of corruption. She was a high-profile spokesperson for the movement, and she was shot in her home. And there's still no justice in that case either. They receive death threats on a daily basis. Many of them have been granted protective measures by the state because there's a recognition of the danger that they're in. And yet even those are not guarantees for their safety. And they continue to do it because they can't stop. There's no greater pain than the loss of a child in this world. And the fact that on top of that, they have to face danger and threats from organized crime, but as well, often, from a callous and indifferent government is the ultimate injustice.
And finally, tell us more about your part in this movement. Why are you involved?
Elaine, I've had the privilege to work with a national organization that groups over 150 of these collectives like the one we saw. They're small collectives. They're all over the country, unfortunately, because the problem is all over the country. I work in documentation for the movement and searching out alliances and networking with other organizations, human rights organizations, and other organizations that have worked on the same issue, not only within Mexico, but on an international basis. These groups rely, because of their lack of funding from the government, their independence from the government, they have to rely on non-governmental organizations to carry out a wide range of duties, such as legal services, psychological services, and to contribute to analysis and an ongoing learning process of what are the causes of what's happening to us, what can we do in the face of this very dangerous situation. I've been a part of that. I've been on the searches, and there are hundreds of other individuals like me that make it possible for this movement to continue because they're really operating on air. They have no resources, but they have this tremendous will because a mother, a father, a family member can never forget a missing child, and they, even if they have no money, from one day to the next, are going to continue with this work.
Laura Carlsen, thank you for joining us from Mexico City.
America's Now.